Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Cope. I'm Director of Strategy and Innovation at RTI Innovation Advisors, and I'd love to welcome you to today's webinar. We have, I think, a very interesting topic to dive into today. What I believe is a rather compelling and timely application of strategic foresighting, and that is how we can use foresighting to better understand emerging consumer needs and the near-term environment that we're thinking of as new normal. What are those post-COVID consumer habits that are going to retain? How are they going to make purchasing decisions? What will the environment be like next month or 6 months from now that we're finding consumers operating in, and how can we position ourselves to be supportive and helpful of consumers in that environment? We're going to dig into that today, and I look forward to sharing some of our thoughts with you on that. Before we get into the topic, let me do a quick introduction to our team. Some of you maybe have not worked with us before, so let me introduce our group and some of the work that we do. Think of RTI Innovation Advisors as a mission-driven innovation consultancy. That's in part because we're based in a mission-driven research institute called RTI International, but also it's what drives us in our day-to-day activities. There's work that we do in innovation that falls into usually one of three primary areas, and these are outlined on the screen here now. Our first is working with discerning complex futures. We help organizations find clarity, find direction through complex futures, and traditionally that has been dealing with very long time horizons. How do we look beyond traditional strategic planning time horizons, which might be 2 years, 3 years, perhaps even 5? How can we use tools like foresighting to look further down that time horizon and prepare today for what those future scenarios might be? You're going to hear today that we can take some of those same methodologies and apply them to the here and now, because the complex future has arrived, and it's what we're all dealing with in our current situation. So we help organizations understand how to apply these kind of methodologies. Similarly, we work with innovation and new product development teams to help them explore the world of the possible. What are some of the new emerging external technologies, external partners, growth opportunities that they can start to pursue that will help them achieve their goals of breakthrough and disruptive innovation? Our third area of work has to do with connecting technologies and markets. And in this line of work, we're traditionally working with those who are creating very early stage, nascent kind of technologies in universities and federal labs. We're helping connect them to partners in industry who represent the best channel to market, who can help bring those technologies to the best applications so that they can have the greatest impact. So this, in a nutshell, is the places where we work, where we engage with companies and foundations and research labs to increase the impact that innovation can have. We're glad to have you with us today. Looking forward to the discussion. And I'm going to turn things over now to my colleague, Jim Redden.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. Before we get started today, I just wanted to offer kind of my own thoughts for a moment on this intersection of mission and innovation. Jeff mentioned that we are part of a larger institute, RTI International, which is a 5,000 member research institute that's really anchored in scientific research and bringing the benefits of science to the world for global impact. As innovation advisors, we believe in the power of innovation to enact positive change in the world. And all you have to do is look around and see from kind of the tumultuous changes that have happened in the last 6 months, from pandemics to protests, economic uncertainty, kind of political and social divisions. We need change. We need positive change, and we need change that can inspire a better future. So more than ever, I think, as innovators, we have to kind of hold this paradox of the present reality and challenges we're facing today, together with a positive vision of what the future might be. And over the next hour, we're going to talk about how we can use the tactics and tools of strategic foresight to help us grapple with not only what's going on in the present, but also envision alternate versions of what the future might become. and then use that to inspire ourselves, our teams, and our organizations to chart a path to the preferred future, one where our organizations and teams are having that positive impact that is core to our mission and our belief in the power of innovation. So what do we have? We have an hour that's going to be jam-packed with content. We're going to start by talking about the challenge that's facing organizations today with all of these tumultuous changes. We'll then spend some time kind of introducing strategic foresight. What is it? How is it used? And what are the benefits and why it works? We'll then take you through RTI's process, structured process for conducting strategic foresight projects, and give you a few hints at some tips and tricks for each step along the way. Last but not least, we'll end with kind of a short case study where we'll offer you some potential insights and reflections from our own practice of strategic foresight on what the next normal or the new normal might look like for consumers. As we get started here today, I just want to kind of reiterate two things. Number one, use the Q&A box to pose questions when you have them. We'll try to save some time at the end for addressing some of those questions. If we don't get to them in this webinar, we'll certainly follow up and try to address those questions afterwards. We're looking forward to hearing kind of what's going on in your organizations as well. Okay, so let's start with the challenge. What's going on? Well, we certainly know that the global pandemic, COVID-19, has really kind of caused a step change across society. Before COVID, our organization would routinely work, as Jeff mentioned, in strategic foresight with organizations on longer time horizons. And our message was that the pace of change is accelerating, right? Over the last decade, the pace of change that organizations have to grapple with seemed to be at an all-time high. Well, that all-time high that was 6 months ago now seems like a much more comfortable pace of change as we've encountered the literal step changes and forcing functions that have galvanized all kinds of downstream effects in supply chains, consumer behavior, organizational operations, and working from home, et cetera. Amidst the mind-boggling kind of variety and speed of change, it can be helpful to have some frameworks to kind of anchor our understanding. This framework is by no means the only framework you can use, but we're going to introduce one here that we'll use for this webinar. When we think of the changes that are happening, we can look at categories like supply chains. What's happening in supply chains and how's that impacting kind of organizational operations? We can also look at things like the shift to remote work, kind of ensuring safety and kind of hygiene inside internal operations for many organizations. We can also look at kind of consumer behavior. The customers that we serve as organizations have had their lives upended just like our working lives have been upended. And all three of these categories of change kind of fit within the broader kind of context of mega trends that are happening, social dynamics that are shifting, technological advances that are occurring, political uncertainty with elections on the horizon, and even climate change and other global forces still persisting in the backdrop of these rapid and recent changes. That level of change is causing lots of challenges for organizations. So to get started here, to help frame the conversation and really kind of help me highlight the right things in the next part of the webinar, we want to ask you a poll question. So there are many challenges associated with managing change, managing complexity. We want to know what challenges are a priority for you and your team over the next 3 months. So we'll have the Zoom meeting should have just launched a poll. Go ahead and take some time, read through the options, and select all that apply. If you're having challenges with the polling system through Zoom, feel free to chat your answers into the chat box using the Zoom window. I'll take a pause and let people read through and think about their answers for a minute. right, interesting results coming in. I'll give you just about 4 or 5 more seconds to kind of get your answers in. Okay, great. So let's take a look here. Interesting. All right, so a lot of interest so far in revising product launch and growth strategy, rethinking product mix, and then developing the future view of the workforce. Okay, that's good insights. As more challenges come to mind through the course of this webinar, feel free to drop those into the chat as well. So there's certainly a lot of challenges across all aspects of our organization, but the framing for this webinar today is really zooming in on this box of change around consumer behavior and asking the question, how can organizations understand future consumer behavior when there's so much uncertainty around the broader forces that are going to drive and shape that change? So just in the last 3 months alone, we've seen a profound impact on consumers' lives as a result of quarantine and as a result of kind of COVID more broadly. Everything from kind of new buying patterns, increased grocery shopping, things about isolation, increased mental health challenges. But there's also been some positive kind of elements as well. There seems to be a new value on kind of healthcare heroes, more investment in personal hobbies, and lots of expressions of creativity and support. So with the backdrop of all of this change, the fundamental question for today is going to be around how can we better understand the new normal for our consumers? What's going to change about their behavior, their priorities, their buying patterns, their decisions? Which of these hint at lasting changes that will persist for the next 1, 3, 5 years or more, and which may kind of fade away as life hopefully kind of returns to a state where COVID is no longer in the forefront of our minds. So traditionally, as innovation teams seek to answer questions about consumer behavior, they have a robust set of established tools. One of the primary methods that innovation teams use for obtaining consumer insights is design thinking. Right? Design thinking starts with an emphasis on kind of observing and inquiring and empathizing with the behavior of our customers. And there's well-established tools from ethnographic interviews, customer interviews, and focus groups, or more data-driven approaches that leverage whether it's our historical organizational data or proactive surveys, etc. One of the challenges, though, with design thinking is that by observing the present, we are implicitly assuming that the future is going to be like the present. And design thinking as a methodology is somewhat inadequate and tends to kind of break down as our certainty that the future will be like the present kind of goes away. So if we take this fictional kind of example of some type of consumer behavior and we look at how that's historically been changing over time, yes, there has been changing to consumer behavior, but the changes have followed trends. They've been slow, that you can reasonably assume that the trend you observe today is indicative of how things will evolve. That gives product design teams enough confidence to design products for 6 months from now that they can be reasonably certain are going to resonate with their customers. But then we approach here this step change, if you will, that has happened in consumer behavior because of COVID. And we're at the end of this kind of step change looking forward, and we are not sure what the future might be. In particular, the observations of the present moment, you can't necessarily assume that that is going to persist. It may be that the things we're observing today proceed and consumer behavior remains relatively unchanged from, here we are in June 2020. Alternatively, as the COVID situation evolves, we may see behavior change even further in the direction that it has over the last 3 months. But that's not a given either. Alternatively, as COVID kind of evolves, as the situation in the pandemic evolves, we may see a return to kind of some of these pre-COVID trends. Here we're thinking on things like maybe an interest in sustainability or other types of things that consumer products companies were actively using to inform their product development cycles just 6 months ago. Or alternatively, there could be another step change on the horizon. So the challenge for product development and innovation teams right now is how do we design our innovation portfolios or even envision kind of where our company should be going amidst this high level of uncertainty. You might think, well, we can use the same design thinking tools to survey customers about their intended future behavior. But one thing that kind of research into psychology can show us is that consumers are relatively poor predictors of their own future behavior. Now, Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, has done a lot of great work on cognitive biases, popularized through the field of study known as behavioral economics. And one of the anchors there is that consumer behavior is kind of impacted or informed by these cognitive biases. So you can't just ask consumers about what they'll do in the future because they're not good predictors of their own behavior. Similarly, Daniel Gilbert, another psychologist, has studied deeply not just predictions about behavior, but even predictions about consumers' future feelings. And it turns out consumers are also poor predictors of how they're going to feel in the future. So even in the best of times, we can't rely on the observations of the present and questions to consumers about their future behavior to inform our work today. You marry against that the backdrop that there are several major forces that are highly uncertain that are going to continue to drive consumer behavior, from the development of the vaccine and the spread of the virus all the way through to the economic situation, what that will look like in the next six months. So innovation teams intending to pursue product development goals need a new approach to augment their design thinking practices. And that's what brings us to strategic foresight, right? Strategic foresight is kind of a methodology that's been developed to help innovation and strategic planning teams deal with uncertainty. Now, as Jeff mentioned at the beginning, traditionally strategic foresight is practiced kind of on longer time horizons, 5 years out, 10 years out, or further. The primary reason for that is because the methodology is intentionally designed to deal in scenarios where uncertainty is high. But we're in a situation today where, there may be as much uncertainty in the next 1 year as there is in the next 5 years, which is why strategic foresight as a methodology can be applied and can help. So let's do a quick introduction to strategic foresight. Most people, when they talk about the future, refer to it as just that, the future. But as we've heard kind of already, the future itself is fundamentally unknowable. So what strategic foresight practitioners do is they actually refer to futures plural. You'll hear strategic foresight practitioners and futurists, seldom will they say the future. They'll talk about alternative futures, scenario planning, or futures plural. This is because strategic foresight as a discipline is a method for kind of wrestling with the uncertainty inherent in alternative futures. And strategic foresight uses scenario planning to inform the actions and activities of innovation teams in the present. Just like design thinking it's kind of hard to pin it down to a single definition, the same is true of strategic foresight. Foresight is first and foremost kind of a mindset. It's a way to approach specific problems. It's a way to think about conditions of uncertainty and do scenario planning. It is also a process. Strategic foresight is helped by a structured process to help teams kind of systematically explore trends, create futures, and wrestle with the implications of those futures. And because it's been around for a long time, there is a robust set of tools and techniques that futurists and foresight practitioners use to deploy the kind of the mindset and the process and bring those benefits to organizations. In the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to kind of run through what that mindset is and then talk a little bit more about the process. So let's start with mindset. The real purpose of strategic foresight and any type of futures thinking is not to predict the future. And that's kind of the anchoring that we need to keep in our mind throughout the rest of this presentation and anytime you're kind of thinking about using strategic foresight. Instead, the examination of alternate futures, alternate scenarios, and the forces that are driving that change helps change the mental models that teams and decision makers carry in their heads as they evaluate the strategic direction of their organization or make very tactical decisions like portfolio planning or new product development and design. So with that said, we're not predicting the future. At the same time, we're not simply creating science fiction. These are not just kind of stories drawn out of thin air, and there's a very strong distinction between alternative futures created through strategic foresight and the world of science fiction. One of the things that we can do as foresight practitioners is look at the present and analyze the forces that are driving change. We can look at forces shaping the future, everything from climate change to economic kind of conditions to perhaps the development of vaccine. As we look at those forces that are driving change, some of them we can be relatively certain about how they'll evolve, while as others, they're highly uncertain and they could go either way. These forces become the anchors for the alternative scenarios and the futures that we create. So after kind of rigorously and systematically analyzing these forces, we use them to produce distinct alternate futures. Now, I really like these two words on this slide because I think it anchors us in what makes a really good alternative scenario and alternative future. We want these futures to be plausible, as in they're rooted in observable signals, but we also want them to be provocative because they should in some way help push the thinking of teams and organizations grounded in what we can see today, but in ways that help inspire new modes of thinking and new realizations about what might be. As innovators, as innovation practitioners, you know, our goal of helping to shape the future really starts with the story that we create about what might be. So strategic foresight is really inherent in innovation practice because imagining and sharing alternate versions of the future is the starting point for entrepreneurs with a grand vision. It's the starting point for innovation teams that are seeking to enact change or provide products that are better for their customers. Strategic foresight can help us not only envision alternate futures, but it can also be the first step in creating that preferred future scenario for us, our organizations, and ultimately the consumers that we're working for. So that's a little bit about foresight, the mindset. Now let's move on to a quick discussion of the foresight process. We'll be talking today about kind of RTI's foresight process, but other organizations have their own. You'll find a lot of similarities across processes. Our innovation process, our strategic foresight process, has four main elements: frame, explore, envision, and act. And the reason that a structured process is beneficial is that for many teams, the number of signals and drivers and analyzing and dealing with complexity and ambiguity can really make your head explode. It's really tough. Having a structured process brings rigor and kind of confidence to teams that are trying to wrestle with that uncertainty and make sense of it. When we work with kind of innovation groups, walking them through a strategic foresight process, we have two kind of time scales that we typically work on. We help them through 1 to 2 week foresight sprints where we'll walk through this process in a really condensed fashion for folks that are trying to get kind of quick insights and make strategic decisions relatively quickly. We also engage in longer kind of foresight initiatives, longer period over 3 to 6 months, perhaps seeking to help drive organizational change rather than small team insights. But regardless of whether we're doing this over 1 to 2 weeks or 3 to 6 months, kind of the process remains the same. So let's go through those stages, and I'll tell you a little bit more about each one. As you think about starting a Foresight process, the framing is incredibly important. Kind of setting yourself up for success at the very beginning is critical to kind of what's going to happen in later stages. So I'll leave you with just a couple tips for if you're setting out to frame your own Foresight exploration. Number one, foresighting is always best when conducted with a diverse group of people. Foresighting is a team sport. Absolutely, an individual can sit at their desk to look at signals and drivers of change and make decisions. But what we found through our work is that the power of foresighting and analyzing signals is amplified when diverse perspectives come and comment on what's going on. So intentionally select during the framing stage your team. We have found that teams of 4 to 6 are an ideal number for a Foresight activity. Once you have that core team, you can expand to larger groups if you're trying to engage 30 or 40 or more inside an organization. The next insight around framing a good Foresight activity is to really be intentional about what the scope of that foresighting practice is. I've seen teams go way too broad and try to tackle a domain that is just massive, right? The future of the world is not a good starting point. Even something like the future of health seems very broad and is going to take a lot of time to kind of synthesize or wrap your mind around. On the other end of the spectrum, I've seen teams go, this typically happens kind of with technical teams, they get really way too narrow too quickly. The future of antibacterial ointments is a little bit too narrow. You probably want to zoom that out. So being intentional about finding that Goldilocks theme in the beginning and bringing together a diverse group are 2 key aspects of that framing stage. Once you've got your Foresight activity kind of set up, the next step is to really look broadly for the signals and the drivers and the trends that are going to shape the way the future unfolds. We always do this in a very systematic fashion as opposed to kind of ad hoc. We want to make sure that we're exploring not only the domain of interest, but broader forces outside the narrow topical focus area that are going to shape that domain in new and different ways. We often use kind of the STEEP model to ensure that we're looking at changes and forces both at the social level, kind of the technology level, economic, environmental, political, and regulatory. Because regardless of what your focus area is, these trends that are impacting the backdrop to what's happening in the world are going to shape your domain in some way, right? So even if we're looking at something like consumer behavior in, say, kind of the healthcare telemedicine space, there's certainly broader political or social or technological trends that you may not think are immediately relevant, but are going to kind of impact that domain in some way. So after we broadly scan and kind of systematically explore the drivers of change, we have to go through a step of making sense of what those signals and those trends might mean. So the first step is to kind of categorize them, organize them, discuss them, debate their potential impacts before we move on to the next step, which is really envisioning. We've looked at the recent past, we've looked at the present. In this step, we project out into the future. We can anchor that interpretation and that visioning and what we've seen through the explore step, those drivers and signals of change, and then project using kind of structured methods of foresight into alternative future scenarios. So this is just kind of like a typical Envision workshop that we run where it's structured, we have tools, we engage multiple people. We've had to shift all of these kind of workshops, these visioning workshops, these future scenario workshops into the virtual environment because of COVID, just like everybody else. But the key aspect in that visioning step is that you're moving towards alternate visions of the future. So that leads us to our next kind of foresight principle. What do we do once we have those future scenarios? Our next step is to try to translate those future scenarios into impact inside our organizations. And we have found, and we firmly believe, that building organizational conviction for change, whatever that change is, requires more than just reading a report about it. I like to say that strategic foresight is kind of like riding a roller coaster. You can describe to somebody what it's like to ride a roller coaster, but that is not the same at all as actually experiencing it and kind of going through the process yourself. So if the goal is to build organizational conviction and shape strategic decision making, we found that it's absolutely critical that those people who are responsible for making those strategic decisions are brought along through the process and not simply handed a report at the end. So how do we do that? What are some tips for doing that? Well, a lot of that comes down to finding creative ways to immerse people in these future scenarios. You have to bring them to life in ways that enables aha moments. We do that through kind of instructive videos, some through written scenarios, sometimes through kind of timelines and experiences. Regardless of the method, the goal is to bring the scenario to life and immerse people in a way that allows them to have aha moments and change those mental models that they've been carrying all along. So that leads us to our last step. We've explored, we've rooted our alternate futures in observable signals. We have multiple visions. Now what do we do about it? Well, strategic foresight is really kind of one aspect and a key input to a broader innovation strategy, and particularly a resilient innovation strategy. So by participating in strategic foresight, using strategic foresight, you'll have alternate visions about the way the future might unfold. In the planning and action step, you have to wrap those visions of the future together with your organization's mission, your vision, that analysis of, we must make a decision. What future do we want to create? What's our strategic kind of positioning within the broader landscape of our sector? All of those kind of go into creating that strategy that then allows, during the planning and action step, the creation of things like roadmaps, innovation portfolios, set strategic goals, priority partnerships that lead to kind of better decisions about those particular elements because they're informed by alternate visions of the future. I really like to say that design thinking and strategic foresight really complement each other really well. By creating alternate visions of the future, I may learn what kinds of signals and what kinds of questions I should be tracking or asking through my design thinking activities. If, for example, we learn that who and what consumers trust for their information is the key lever that's kind of shaping future A versus future B, I can help my design thinking teams and my innovation teams know this is something we need to be tracking regularly. What's our process for kind of collecting data that's going to inform which of these paths the world seems to be on? It's a great way to focus innovation activities on the things that matter most. Okay, so in summary, the RTI Foresight process takes participants through an experience an experience of plausible future scenarios that aren't science fiction. They're rooted in observable signals and drivers of change. And this experience, when done well, results in kind of new insights, new mental models, and informed strategic decision making and strategic planning. Okay, so let's take a look here at a quick case study. What kind of insights can we offer in 10 minutes to the folks on the line who are kind of in the trenches, if you will? Let's look at a quick example. So broadly speaking, COVID is creating disruptions and accelerating change, as we know, across all of these elements. If we start to look at what signals are emerging as it relates to shifting consumer behavior, we see changes in exercise patterns. We see the emergence of telemedicine. We see an increase in online shopping, new hobbies like bread making and gardening, certainly broad shifts in the way people work in the virtual environment, and even disruptions to home life from schools closing and parents taking on new roles as homeschool teachers. All of these consumer behavior changes are against the backdrop of some really important, broader trends that are happening in the world today. Certainly the political unrest and criminal justice reform is something that cannot be ignored. And we may think, hey, that's not really related to my domain, but it's impacting people's lives on a daily basis. And so we can't ignore kind of some of these broader trends that are happening in the background. I think it's also particularly interesting to look at how free speech and kind of technology providers as intermediaries to speech, namely Twitter and Facebook, how that is evolving. And that represents to me a key uncertainty about the way the future might unfold. Will we see tech giants like Twitter become arbiters of truth in some fashion? Or will they take the Facebook path and say, we staunchly kind of are firmly set against inserting ourselves in that arbitration of truth? There's the economic realities that are the backdrop of our consumers' lives, as well as kind of the consumer health concerns related to COVID. And lastly, there's also global geopolitical tensions that are starting to emerge and shift between the United States and China that could have real implications to our supply chains, to our global strategies as organizations. And that's something that, we're also represents, I think, a key uncertainty moving forward. So all of this change is way too much to try to tackle in a 10-minute example, and wrapping our mind around the implications of even just those 8 to 12 changes that we highlighted is too much for 10 minutes. So we're going to narrow in, get really focused for a minute, and hopefully show you how using signals of the present combined with an exploration of a future vision can lead to insights. So to do that, we're going to go through an exercise called 5 minutes to the future, where we're going to frame up a particular domain, pull selectively some signals in an effort to tell a story about a plausible future that may lead, hopefully, to some insights for you and your teams. We've selected for today kind of a deep dive into the future of grocery shopping. That's where we'll tell our story for the next 5 minutes. So if we're running through our Foresight process here in just 5 minutes, we have to say, all right, we had to look very broadly at what was going on in the world. And I've curated a handful of kind of like 7 or 8 signals here out of the hundreds that we could have drawn from. And these signals point to the story I'm about to tell. So starting from left to right, we absolutely know that consumers are doing more grocery shopping, and quarantining and kind of the run on different supplies has left consumers with a different taste, a different attitude about what it means to acquire food in their home. As restaurants are shut down, takeout has increased, etc. In that same period, we saw an increased adoption of grocery delivery services like Instacart, online ordering through various apps associated with whether not just Amazon in the traditional sense, but even places like Kroger or other grocery retailers. We also noticed that select grocery stores, including both Whole Foods and national chains like Kroger, designated some of their grocery stores as pickup only, as in they didn't let consumers into the store anymore. Instead, it was solely focused on fulfillment of online orders. We saw them and said, that's interesting. Let's play with that a little bit further. Well, we know 3 years ago, Amazon acquired Whole Foods. And there was a lot of speculation at the time about, is Amazon making a move into grocery? What does this mean for the future of grocery, et cetera? Even before COVID, you could look at kind of Amazon's strengths in its traditional ability to understand logistics and delivery, and imagine how that might be applied to the grocery space if they decided to make a more concentrated move in that direction. So we know even today, Amazon warehouses are highly efficient and heavily utilize automation and robotics to help drive that efficiency into 2-day delivery. We also can observe that in the present day, the layout of grocery stores is not optimized for efficiency. In fact, you might make the case that the layout of grocery stores is actually optimized to keep consumers in the store and increase the amount of food that they purchase through that experience of wandering the aisles. Last but not least, the last signal I'll pull here is we are likely headed for some kind of recession, right? And Amazon in its in some of its consumer products categories has launched its own brand, Amazon Basics. Utilizing a lot of the data that it has started to create kind of its own branded products that it can sell perhaps at a discount to others, and certainly with a channel advantage given that it owns a lot of the online channels. Okay, so even that alone in 5 minutes is a lot of signals to wrap your head around and make sense of. Where are we going with this? So I'll paint a picture for you. This is just one of many possible future scenarios, and the things that I'm about to say are not true. The headlines I'm about to show are fictional and made up. So be careful just kind of screen grabbing this and saying, oh yeah, these are real stories. They're not. But let's imagine that Jeff Bezos, as CEO of Amazon, says, why is milk in the back of the grocery store? That's ridiculous. It's time to rethink the grocery experience. And if Amazon, with its advantages in the space, decided to press into online grocery delivery, we could envision where Amazon creates lights out groceries, applies its knowledge of efficiency and product delivery to the grocery space. All of a sudden, we have tailwinds moving people in that direction. More consumers doing online shopping, more consumers being comfortable with kind of this pickup or delivery as signaled by the creation of dark groceries already. Similarly, because of the recession, perhaps consumers' money gets tight, they look for more generic products and goods. Amazon decides, hey, we could release our own food brand called something like Amazon Staples and start to compete in the generics category with our knowledge of consumers, our ability to disintermediate, if you will, grocery stores and chains. And there are potential scenarios on the horizon where autonomous vehicle delivery or even kind of food storage mechanisms, like, perhaps they announce like a food box, which is more or less a mailbox for food that facilitates online delivery of groceries. All of these kind of paint a certain picture of a future in which Amazon becomes a major player in the retail space, and a lot of the ways that customers think about, acquire, and get food into their homes has fundamentally shifted. You could look at all of these and say, all these signals were present potentially before COVID, but what's happened because of the pandemic is many of these have been accelerated. Many of these things now seem more plausible than they were just 3 months ago. So that leads us to the planning and action step, where as an organization, we might have to wrestle with a really tough question. What might this future mean for the consumer products that we sell through our grocery store outlets? Previously, brands and retailers paid premiums for shelf space to facilitate that customer discovery process. What happens when the new customer experience disintermediates the walking through of the grocery store? Again, these are things that people were already probably thinking about prior to COVID, but we've seen a dramatic acceleration because of the pandemic. So similarly, it's not all necessarily positive changes. How are consumers reconciling this increase in online ordering with increased packaging waste? Right? What solutions are emerging for people who are reconciling that? And importantly, can we use our design thinking teams to start to track that a little bit more explicitly? We'll skip here kind of to the last one. Fundamentally, we really want to be asking, what kinds of strategic moves should we as a innovation team or as a company be making as a result of kind of the signals and the trends that we're seeing here and the way consumer behavior may fundamentally change? So I'll point to kind of an example of a company that has in the last month actually acted on some of these signals. You may or may not be familiar that within the last 30 days, PepsiCo recently launched 2 direct-to-consumer websites where you can order your favorite snacks, your favorite Pepsi products to be delivered directly to your door. So we have not talked with PepsiCo about kind of that decision. We have not talked about what signals they were observing. But you could envision a scenario pretty easily where they said, wow, disintermediation of retail is on the horizon. The way we relate to our customers needs to be a much more direct channel. How can we kind of start to move in that direction? The thing that I find particularly fascinating about this example is perhaps this was on the radar of PepsiCo prior to COVID, but in an article where someone was interviewed from PepsiCo about this decision, they said they developed and launched the website in less than 30 days once they realized what was happening in the shift to online shopping as a result of COVID. So that points to, yes, changes and insights from strategic foresight can have long-term implications, but they can drive meaningful and concrete actions that lead to new products, new services, new paths to market in the near term. So let's quickly recap here before we answer a couple questions. We've seen that consumer behavior has radically changed because of COVID-19. And we recognize that traditional innovation approaches like design thinking, they're valuable and they should continue, but they need to be complemented by alternative methods. We believe that strategic foresight is a great tool for structured exploration of alternative futures and then using those insights to inform actions in the present. And we typically do this in the context of 1 to 2 week sprints with small teams that really provide quick insights and focus, or longer initiatives focused on re-envisioning kind of strategic position or broader kind of strategy level questions inside organizations. So with that, we'll move to the Q&A section. I'll ask Jeff to tee up some of the questions that have been coming in from the audience here. If you have questions, now is a great time to kind of drop them in.
Let's use the Q&A function to provide any additional questions. Let's give a moment for a few more to come in. Here's one coming in. Any real-world examples that you can share? This is from Robert. Examples of what? Can we add a little more? Lots of examples, yes. But give me a little guidance there, and I'll try to narrow in on the example that you're looking for. He says examples that the method works. Okay. So one thing that I can say, a lot of the work that we do with companies in the strategic space, we can't speak openly about it, but I will say that prior to COVID, we were engaged with a food and beverage company doing a strategic foresight activity. And one of the outputs of that strategic foresight activity was kind of the recommendation or a strong discussion inside the organization about what that future direct-to-consumer channel would look like or might have to look like given some of the potential shifts on the horizon. That, in terms of quote-unquote working, I can say that without participating in that exercise, I find it unlikely that the conversations around that topic would have had the same level of buy-in from the strategic decision makers that were present. As we know in our organizations, there can be a strong bias towards the status quo. And it can be hard to shake people out of the future is going to be like the present mindset. This method, I've seen it in the past, work very effectively at driving those strategic conversations in ways that without the experience of foresight probably would not have happened. I know that's kind of vague and kind of trying to dance around the concreteness of that particular example, but hopefully that was helpful. No other questions coming in at the moment.
Okay, great. I'll share a few more kind of related insights that that kind of I've been thinking about as alternative mental models to shape strategic decision making and strategic thinking. As we look at consumer behavior, one of the major questions I hear a lot is, how can I differentiate between something that's likely to stick around and be a persistent change to behavior and something that is likely going to kind of shift and maybe revert back as the situation unfolds? And here, I actually draw on my background as a chemical engineer to draw an analogy to kind of chemistry. So when we think of kind of reactions and chemistry, there's a state of equilibrium that molecules attempt to find. One thing that I've observed and I would hypothesize is that for consumer behaviors where the new equilibrium is a better condition than the old equilibrium, you're likely to see that behavior persist. And if the new equilibrium was better, you may ask, what was stopping it from becoming the norm prior to COVID? Well, a lot of times in chemistry, there's like a certain activation energy or a catalyst that needs to happen to make a reaction proceed. When we think of consumer behavior, take, for example, the use of telemedicine in healthcare, there was a large barrier prior to COVID that kind of prevented the adoption, both regulatory hurdles, behavior hurdles, prevented the adoption of telemedicine as a broadly applicable tool across the sector. Yet, because of the sharp change in the drive because of COVID, we've seen a new potential equilibrium with the use of telemedicine broadly in some cases that may actually, I think, persist because that barrier was the only thing keeping the industry from moving in that direction.
And we have a couple more questions come in. Are there any competition for this foresighting approach?
Competition. So if you're talking about kind of practitioner, Jeff, do you think it's other practitioners of foresight or other kind of foresighting approaches?
I think we've got some elaboration on it now. So I think it's meaning other tools and methodologies to map out future opportunities or experiment with future business models. And so what are some other methods? And then how does the follow-on question is, how does strategic foresight stand out from that? How is it facilitate better answers?
Absolutely. So I'll highlight the fact that strategic foresight, kind of like design thinking, is a broad approach with many tools and methods embedded within the kind of the construct. Just like innovation as a domain has lots of approaches, methodologies that support the delivery of the benefit. Strategic foresight has multiple tools for kind of exploring uncertainty, making decisions amongst conditions of uncertainty. We didn't take a deep dive into the tools in this webinar because of time, but each one has its strengths and weaknesses, its appropriate and not as appropriate use cases, which is a great idea to kind of go into in a future webinar. Broadly though, when we're thinking about foresight as a domain, the strengths are that it can help you wrestle with uncertainty. The weaknesses, by and large, are that it doesn't point you to a single answer. Right? The inherent uncertainty about the future means it's not a method for X equals 5, as in a directive for the company to pursue. Instead, it's a starting point for a new way to galvanize critical conversations that kind of once you have them, you can more confidently chart that course to the future you're trying to create.
Another question is around the 5 minutes to the future example that you walked through. Robert asks, how might a vaccine change your example view?
So if I were to layer in what impacts will the vaccine have on that example, I would look at and ask the question, what impacts on the motivators of consumer behavior will be changed by the presence or absence of a vaccine? broadly speaking, I think the drive, the inherent drive behind the shift towards contactless, towards online grocery, towards online retail in the recent term has been driven by consumers' fear for their own safety, preference for, kind of not low contact approaches because of the perceived risk associated with those activities. If we magically said in the future there's a vaccine and COVID is no longer a threat, that driver for the shift to online grocery kind of goes away in some sense. Now, I don't think that changes the long-term outlook for what future the potential kind of disintermediation that online retail and autonomous vehicles might provide to traditional retail channels. I think it more or less changes the speed. It's a dial on the speed at which those changes might occur. That's a good question and a lot of fun to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think that's it for the Q&A.
Awesome. Well, please, if you have other questions, if you put questions in the chat, we'll try to follow up and answer those questions directly with you since we kind of are out of time for today. If you have other questions about strategic foresight or want to know more about the trends that we're seeing, the ways that we're kind of thinking about the forces that are shaping post-COVID worlds for consumers, particularly in a given industry, feel free to reach out. We love talking about these things. They're a lot of fun to envision and discuss. I'll turn it back over to Jeff for any final closing thoughts.
Yeah, I just want to echo, thanks to Jim for presenting a pretty compelling application of foresighting, and thank you to all of you for participating in the webinar today. We want to keep this conversation going. We're going to share with you a recording of the webinar in case you want to go back and look through some of the content. We'll also share a PDF of the slides of the material that Jim's talked through today. So look for that from us in the next few days. And if you've got questions or ideas about how to apply this, feel free to reach out to us. You see our contact information there. We look forward to hearing more about your thoughts and impressions of how best to use Foresight. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of the day. Take care.